The morning sun beat down on Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso's capital, but inside his modest office, Ibrahim Traoré's focus was absolute. The opulent presidential palaces of other nations felt like a world away. His workspace was simple, functional, a reflection of his military background and no-nonsense approach to leadership. Spread before him were the documents that could seal his country's fate, proposals to reshape its relationship with the foreign mining companies that had grown rich from the soil beneath his feet. At stake were billions in gold, lithium, and rare earth minerals. At stake was the future. His concentration was broken by a soft knock at the door. His chief of staff, Amara Dio, entered with a troubled expression that immediately put him on high alert. Her voice, usually calm and steady, was uncharacteristically tense. "Mr. President," she said, "there's a situation requiring your immediate attention." She handed him a sealed envelope. It had been delivered by a special courier, but it bore no official markings, no return address. Just his name, handwritten in precise, block letters. A cold knot began to form in Traoré's stomach as he carefully opened it. Inside was not a political memo or a diplomatic cable. It was a single photograph, an image that made his blood run cold. It was his mother's house, captured from across the street. The image itself wasn't overtly threatening, but the message it sent was brutally clear. "We know where she is. We are watching your family." Beneath the photo, a short, handwritten note read, "The new mining regulations would be unfortunate for everyone. Reconsider." There was no signature. None was needed. The air in the room grew heavy and still. The distant sounds of the city faded away. For a moment, he was not a president, but a son, struck by a wave of protective fury. Yet, his voice, when he finally spoke, was dangerously calm. "When was this delivered?" he asked, the fury inside him being forged into cold, hard steel. 20 minutes ago, Dio replied. The courier was a local teenager, paid cash to deliver it. Security is already reviewing street camera footage. Traoré nodded, his eyes locked on the photograph. His mother still lived in a modest home in Kaya, the town where he grew up. She had refused to move to the capital, valuing her independence and her community connections. Now, that very independence had been turned into a vulnerability, a weapon to be used against him. He gave his orders, his words sharp and precise. "Increase security around my family. Immediately. But it must be discreet. I don't want my mother alarmed." He looked up from the photo, his gaze piercing. "And get me everything we have on the mining companies opposing the new regulations." "Everything." Dio nodded and left to make the arrangements. Alone again, Traoré felt a cold anger settling deep in his chest. He had faced coup attempts, assassination plots, and immense international pressure. He was a soldier, accustomed to threats against his own life. But this was different. This was not politics or warfare. This was personal. Someone had crossed a sacred line, and in doing so, they had not intimidated him. They had unleashed a side of him they were not prepared to face. The war was no longer about contracts and percentages. It was now about honor. 6,000 miles away, in a world of polished steel and hushed ambition, Richard Thornton concluded a board meeting at the Global X headquarters with a confident, satisfied smile. High above the sprawling London skyline, the atmosphere in the room was one of triumphant consensus. The company's stock had risen 3%, fueled by carefully leaked rumors that the defiant government of Burkina Faso might be reconsidering its proposed mining regulations. The plan, his plan, was working perfectly. As the executives filed out, board member Elizabeth Harrington paused. "Excellent work on the Burkina Faso situation, Richard," she said, her tone a mixture of admiration and relief. "I must admit, I wasn't sure your approach would work with someone like Traoré. He seems so idealistic." Thornton's smile remained fixed, a perfect corporate mask, but his eyes hardened for a fraction of a second. "Everyone has pressure points, Elizabeth," he replied smoothly, the words sliding out like silk. "Even idealists. You just have to know where to apply the pressure." He didn't mention exactly what that approach was. The board knew only that he had opened a dialogue with the Burkinabe government. They didn't need to know the sordid details. Plausible deniability was the first and most important rule of corporate governance 101, a lesson Thornton had mastered long ago. His job was to deliver results, not to burden the board with the moral complexities of how they were achieved. Once he was alone, the silence of the vast office amplifying his sense of control, Thornton opened a secure, encrypted line on his phone. He dialed a number from memory, a number that didn't exist in any official company directory. The voice that answered had a clipped, South African accent. Thornton didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Is it done?" he asked, his voice low and direct. "Message delivered. Confirmed," the voice on the other end replied. "No complications." "Excellent," Thornton said, a flicker of genuine satisfaction crossing his face. "Maintain surveillance, but take no further action unless instructed." He ended the call and gazed out of the floor-to-ceiling window at the city below, a sprawling map of power and money. Global X had far too much invested in Burkina Faso to allow some young, upstart leader with a messianic complex to rewrite the rules. For decades, the system had worked. Global X extracted the minerals, the host country received a modest, manageable fee, and shareholders were rewarded with ever-increasing dividends. It was a stable, profitable ecosystem. Traoré's reforms weren't just a threat to their profit margins in one African nation, they were a threat to the entire model. If Burkina Faso could successfully defy them, it could set a dangerous precedent, inspiring other nations to demand more. He had assessed the young leader perfectly, or so he thought. Traoré was a soldier, a patriot. Such men always had one glaring weakness: their devotion to things beyond themselves. Family, country, honor. While they saw these as strengths, Thornton saw them as levers. By sending that photograph, he hadn't just threatened an old woman in a small town. He had targeted the very foundation of Traoré's identity. He had forced the idealist to choose between his principles and the safety of his mother. And in Thornton's world, family always won. The game was over. All that was left was to wait for the inevitable, quiet surrender. He had poked the African lion, and he was confident it would now retreat back into its cave. He had no idea that he hadn't just poked it, he had wounded its pride, and in doing so, had created a hunter. Back in Ouagadougou, the air in Ibrahim Traoré's office was thick with tension. He sat not with his entire cabinet, but with a small, hand-picked team of his most trusted advisors, a war council convened in the face of a silent, insidious enemy. The photograph and the note lay in the center of the table, a venomous snake coiled amongst the official documents. The first to speak was Finance Minister Omar Ouedraogo, a sharp, meticulous man who understood the language of money better than anyone. He pointed to a complex chart projected on the wall. "Global X stands to lose the most," he stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "Their profit margins on Burkina Faso operations are among their highest worldwide. Our estimates suggest the new regulations would reduce their annual returns by approximately 28%. They have the strongest motive by a significant margin." Next was Intelligence Director Seiko, a woman whose calm demeanor belied a formidable mind. She slid a thin folder across the table towards the president. "And their CEO is Richard Thornton." Inside was a profile. Traoré studied Thornton's photograph, a tall, imposing man in his late 50s with cold, calculating eyes that didn't match his practiced, public smile. Former British military, then the private security sector before moving into corporate mining, Seiko elaborated. He has a well-documented reputation for aggressive, and often ruthless, negotiation tactics. Traoré absorbed the information, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "Do we have any direct connection between Global X and the threat?" he asked, his gaze still fixed on Thornton's face. Seiko hesitated for a moment. "Nothing concrete yet, Mr. President. Not a smoking gun. But we are investigating a private security contractor, Sentinel Worldwide, that recently established operations near Kaya. They claim to be providing logistical support for mining exploration, but several of their key employees have British military backgrounds, a pattern almost identical to Thornton's own career path." Traoré nodded slowly, processing the web of circumstantial evidence. "So, we have strong suspicions, but no definitive proof." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the sprawling, sun-drenched city, his responsibility. It was then that the foreign minister, a seasoned diplomat named Bamako, cautiously voiced the concern that hung in the air. "Sir," he began, his tone respectful but firm, "perhaps we should consider a tactical delay. Postpone the new regulations, just until we can ensure your family's absolute safety and build an undeniable case against them. To provoke them without concrete proof is a significant risk." Traoré turned from the window. His expression was unchanged, but his eyes were burning with a quiet, unshakable intensity that silenced the room. "If I back down now," he said, his voice low but carrying immense weight, "it won't end with just these regulations. We will be sending a message to the world that Burkina Faso can be controlled through threats. That I can be controlled." He paused, looking at each advisor in turn. "We implement the regulations as scheduled. On the original timeline." A wave of tense silence was broken by his next words. "But we will be smart about how we respond to this threat. We will not be reckless." As the meeting concluded and the others began to file out, Traoré motioned for Intelligence Director Seiko to stay behind. When they were alone, the atmosphere shifted. The formal leader was gone, replaced by the calculating mind of a soldier. He spoke in a lower voice, one meant only for her. "I need a backchannel," he said. "Someone inside Global X. Not just a source, but someone who can provide definitive evidence of their involvement. We need the weapon they're trying to use against us." Seiko nodded slowly, understanding the immense risk of such a request. "That won't be easy, sir. Their internal security is world-class. But there might be a way." She leaned forward slightly. "One of our brightest students, on a full government scholarship at the London School of Economics, was recently hired as a junior financial analyst at Global X. It's a low-level position, but it's a foot in the door." "Can we trust them?" Traoré asked, the most important question of all. Sako's affirmation was immediate and certain. "Completely. Her father was a political prisoner under the previous regime. Your government freed him." Traoré nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of the intricate loyalties and histories that bind people to a cause. "Make contact. Carefully." As Seiko left, Traoré felt the true weight of what was coming. He was no longer just a president implementing policy. He was about to engage in a shadow war with a corporation whose annual revenue exceeded his country's entire GDP. The odds were not in his favor. But the enemy had made a fatal error. They had threatened his mother. And in doing so, they had made the fight not just political but sacred. In a tiny, rain-streaked apartment in London, thousands of miles from the sun-baked plains of Burkina Faso, Fatou Diallo sat staring at her laptop screen in disbelief. As a junior financial analyst at Global X, her world was one of spreadsheets, compliance reports, and the endless, humming rhythm of global capitalism. Her access to the company's vast systems was limited, a digital key that only opened a few carefully selected doors. But what she had just stumbled upon while running a series of mundane, standard compliance checks sent a chill down her spine. It was a sequence of payments, small enough to avoid triggering major automated scrutiny, but significant enough to fund a serious operation. The recipient was a company she had never heard of, Sentinel Worldwide. The classification was vague, listed simply as Operational Security, BFA, the internal code for Burkina Faso. Her hands trembled slightly as she cross-referenced the dates. The payments had begun 3 months ago, just as the first whispers of Traoré's new mining regulations began to circulate within the industry. This was not a standard security contract. This was something else, something hidden. With a deep breath, she downloaded the transaction logs to a heavily encrypted drive she kept for personal use. What she was doing was a fireable offense, a clear breach of corporate policy. It could end her nascent career before it had even begun, and potentially lead to devastating legal charges. But she couldn't ignore this. Not after what her family had suffered. She thought of her father, a journalist and university professor who had spent years in a squalid prison for the simple crime of speaking out against the previous corrupt regime. She remembered the day President Traoré's new government took power and, within days, declared a general amnesty for all political prisoners. She remembered the tears of joy as she saw her father walk free, thinner and older, but with his spirit unbroken. Her scholarship, her position in London, her very future, she owed it all to the change that Traoré represented. This was more than a job, it was a debt of honor. As if summoned by her thoughts, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown, encrypted number. The message was simple, almost cryptic. "Coffee tomorrow? An old friend from home." It was the signal. The predetermined code her former professor at LSE, a man with quiet, deep connections to the new government, had told her to expect if her country ever needed her. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It was real. They had reached out. With a steady hand, she replied with a single word, "Yes." Then, moving with meticulous care, She closed the financial reports, triple-checking every action, ensuring she left no digital footprints, no trace of her search. She erased the cache, cleared her recent activity logs, and made it look as though she had simply been running the standard reports she was assigned. She was no spy, but she was the daughter of a man who had survived a dictatorship, and she had learned from him that caution was the key to survival. The game had begun, and she, a junior analyst in a London flat, had just become one of its most important and most vulnerable players. The next morning, in a small, unassuming cafe far from the gleaming towers of London's financial district, Fatou Diallo sat across from a man who introduced himself simply as Omar. He was allegedly a cultural attaché at the Burkina Faso embassy, but his observant eyes and the quiet intensity of his presence suggested a role that had little to do with art exhibitions or cultural exchanges. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension. After a moment of polite, meaningless small talk, Fatou slid a tiny, encrypted drive across the table. Her hand was steady, but her heart was racing. "Payments to a private security firm called Sentinel Worldwide," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper above the clatter of porcelain and the hiss of the espresso machine. "They started 3 months ago, right when the first draft of the new mining regulations was leaked internally. The payment authorizations come directly from the executive level." Omar nodded, his expression unreadable as he deftly pocketed the drive. He didn't thank her, they were beyond such pleasantries. "Is there anything else?" he asked, his gaze sharp. "Anything unusual you've noticed? Meetings not on the official calendar? Communications? Anything concerning Burkina Faso?" Fatou hesitated, replaying the events of the past week in her mind. "There was a meeting," she said, leaning in closer. "Last week. It wasn't on any official schedule. Richard Thornton and another man. I was bringing some quarterly reports to Thornton's office, and I saw them together in his personal meeting room. They stopped talking the moment I entered." Omar's interest visibly sharpened, though his face remained a neutral mask. "This other man, would you recognize him again?" "Yes," Fatou said immediately. He was distinctive. Ex-military type. Hard eyes, scars on his face. She paused, then added a detail that had been nagging at her ever since. "There's something else. After I left, I realized I'd forgotten a document on the tray. I went back a minute later. The door was still ajar. They were looking at photographs." "Photographs of what?" Omar pressed. "I only caught a glimpse," she admitted. "But it looked like a house. A Burkina-style house with a mango tree in the yard. It looked familiar, like houses from back home." Omar's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. A house in Burkina Faso. It was the missing piece, the link that connected the money to the threat. "Fatou," he said, his voice now laced with a new gravity. "Would you be willing to continue providing information? It would be extremely dangerous for you." She didn't have to think about it. She thought of her father, of the years he had lost in prison for daring to imagine a better future for his country. She thought of how President Traoré's administration had turned that dream into a reality, freeing political prisoners within days of taking power. This was her chance to defend that new reality. "Yes," she said firmly. "But I need to know. What is happening?" Omar hesitated, weighing the risk of disclosure against the need for her committed cooperation. He made a decision. "We believe Global X may be threatening the president's family to stop the new mining regulations," he replied, his voice low and serious. "Your information could be crucial in protecting them, and in securing our country's resources for our people." A surge of both fear and fierce determination washed over Fatou. It was worse than she had imagined. "Tell me what you need me to do," she said. As they continued to talk, planning their next steps in hushed tones, neither of them noticed the man sitting 2 tables away, seemingly absorbed in his newspaper. He was nondescript, easily overlooked. But as Omar and Fatou eventually stood up and went their separate ways, the man carefully folded his paper, his eyes briefly following Fatou as she disappeared into the London crowd. It was James Kerr, the head of operations for Sentinel Worldwide. He was the man with the scars and the hard eyes. He had been tracking Omar, the cultural attaché, since he first entered the country. The meeting with the young woman from Global X was an unexpected, and potentially problematic, development. The hunter had just spotted the mole inside his client's organization. And now, he had a new target. While the shadow war played out in the cafes of London, Ibrahim Traoré made a move on a different front. Under the guise of a routine family visit, he traveled to Kayad to see his mother. His security detail, now tripled in size, moved discreetly, melting into the familiar patterns of the neighborhood. They sat in her small, tranquil garden, drinking sweet tea as they had since he was a boy. He studied her face, searching for any sign of distress or awareness of the danger that hovered just out of sight. At 76, Ibrahim Traoré remained as sharp-minded and perceptive as ever. She set her teacup down and gave him a knowing look. "You haven't come all this way just to drink tea with an old woman," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "There's trouble, isn't there?" He considered deflecting, but he knew it would be pointless. His mother had always been able to read him like a book. "There may be," he acknowledged carefully. "Foreign interests who aren't happy with our new policies." Maryam nodded slowly, unsurprised. "And they think threatening your family will make you change your mind." It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. Traoré urged her to come stay at the presidential residence in Ouagadougou, just for a while. She refused, her resolve as strong as his. "This is my home, Ibrahim. I didn't leave when rebels controlled this region, and I won't leave because some foreign businessmen are throwing tantrums." He couldn't help but smile. His determination had clearly been inherited. He settled for her reluctant agreement to accept the additional, discreet security. As they talked, his phone vibrated with a secure message from Intelligence Director Seiko. The message was short and explosive. "Information received. Connection confirmed between Global X and Sentinel. We have evidence of a surveillance operation targeting your family." It was the final piece he needed. The time for shadow boxing was over. 3 days later, an elegant charity gala was underway at the British Embassy in Paris. Richard Thornton, in town for a series of high-level business meetings, mingled effortlessly with diplomats and fellow titans of industry. He was in his element, a master of this universe of power and influence. He was completely surprised when an embassy staff member approached him, informing him that there was a secure call he might want to take in the ambassador's private office. Curious, he followed the staff member to a richly appointed study. The door closed behind him, leaving him in opulent silence. The large screen on the desk flickered to life, and Thornton's blood ran cold. He was looking at the calm, composed face of Ibrahim Traoré, sitting in what appeared to be his own simple office. "Good evening, Mr. Thornton," Traoré said, his voice even and devoid of any emotion. "I believe it's time we spoke directly, rather than through photographs and implied threats." Thornton's face betrayed nothing, a lifetime of corporate poker serving him well, but his mind raced. How had Traoré arranged this call through the British Embassy's ultra-secure system? It was a stunning display of power and reach. "President Traoré," he replied, his voice a smooth, cool facade. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're referring to." "I think you do," Traoré responded. The screen suddenly split. On one side was his face, on the other, financial records began to scroll. They were the same ones Fatou had provided. "Payments from Global X to Sentinel worldwide," Traoré narrated calmly. "A company staffed largely by former military contractors. A company currently conducting surveillance operations in Kaya." He let the words hang in the air for a moment. "That would constitute corporate espionage at a minimum. At worst, it's an act of aggression against a sovereign state." Thornton's expression finally hardened. Those documents were obtained illegally, and they proved nothing about any surveillance. "Perhaps," Traoré acknowledged, "but they would certainly justify an investigation. One that would involve freezing all of Global X's assets in Burkina Faso pending the outcome. I imagine your board, and your shareholders, would have some very pointed questions about that." The implied threat was gone, replaced by a direct one. Traoré was prepared to escalate this conflict into the open, a public war that Global X could not afford. "What do you want?" Thornton asked, his voice now stripped of its earlier smoothness, replaced by cold fury. "For you to understand something," Traoré replied, leaning forward slightly. "Burkina Faso is not a colony. It is not a resource to be exploited. It is a nation of people who deserve to benefit from their own natural wealth. The new regulations will proceed as planned." He paused, delivering the final terms of his ultimatum. "The surveillance of my family will end immediately. Sentinel operatives will leave Burkina Faso within 48 hours. If they do not, they will be arrested and tried as spies." Thornton's mind was a whirlwind of calculations. Fighting this could be catastrophic. But surrendering would set a dangerous precedent for Global X's operations across the globe. "And if these demands are met," he asked carefully, What guarantees do we receive that Global X won't simply be expelled from Burkina Faso entirely? None, Traoré said simply. You will operate under the new regulations, just like every other company. You will follow our laws. Your profit margins will decrease, but they will remain substantial. Or you can refuse, and I will use every tool at my disposal to ensure Global X never extracts another gram of gold from our soil. The sheer directness was startling. Thornton was used to dealing with politicians who couched their threats in diplomatic language. Traoré was being explicit. This was the choice. I'll need to consult with my board, Thornton said finally, buying time. Traoré nodded once. You have 24 hours to begin withdrawing Sentinel personnel. After that, this conversation becomes public. The screen went dark, leaving Thornton alone in the silent, ornate study, the reflection of a defeated man staring back at him from the blank screen. He took a moment to compose himself before returning to the glittering gala, but his mind was racing through options, none of them good. He thought he had 24 hours to control the narrative. He had no idea that his opponent's next move had already been made. Richard Thornton walked back into the dazzling reception, a forced smile plastered on his face. He felt the phantom chill of Traoré's ultimatum clinging to him, a stark contrast to the warm, glittering ambiance of the gala. He believed he had a 24-hour window to strategize, to spin the narrative, to rally his board against this unprecedented aggression. He was wrong. Traoré had not been bluffing, and his campaign was already in motion, a multi-pronged attack designed for maximum impact. Before Thornton could even reach the bar for a much-needed drink, he was intercepted by Elizabeth Harrington, the same board member who had congratulated him just days earlier. Her expression was now one of sheer panic. Richard, she said in a hushed, urgent whisper, I've just received the most disturbing call from a contact at the Regulatory Commission. There are rumors spreading like wildfire. Rumors that Global X is involved in some sort of illegal intelligence operation in Burkina Faso. Something about surveillance of government officials. Thornton's blood ran cold. It wasn't a leak. It was a targeted strike. Traoré hadn't waited for his decision. He had preemptively seeded the story through backchannels, ensuring that by the time Thornton spoke to his board, they would already be on the defensive, reacting to a crisis instead of planning a strategy. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. An emergency virtual board meeting was convened the following morning. Thornton, who had expected to lead the discussion, found himself on trial. The questions were not strategic, but accusatory. Board members, who had previously applauded his aggressive tactics, were now terrified of the legal exposure and the looming reputational damage. These allegations, if they have any merit, could trigger anti-corruption investigations in multiple jurisdictions, the company's chief legal counsel warned, her face grim on the video call. The UK Bribery Act, the US Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. The potential penalties are substantial, running into the hundreds of millions, not to mention possible criminal charges. The head of marketing added his own panicked assessment. The public relations nightmare would be biblical. We've spent years and a fortune positioning Global X as an ethical, responsible mining partner. If it becomes public that we are surveilling the family members of African leaders. He didn't need to finish the sentence. In an era of heightened social awareness about corporate behavior in developing nations, such a revelation would be devastating, wiping billions from their market value overnight. The verdict was swift and brutal. I recommend immediate and full compliance with President Traoré's demands, the legal counsel concluded. Terminate the Sentinel contract, withdraw all personnel, and prepare to operate under the new regulations without contest. The vote was nearly unanimous. Only Thornton voted against the motion, a lone voice of defiance swallowed by a chorus of fear and self-preservation. He had miscalculated badly, underestimating both Traoré's intelligence resources and his sheer, uncompromising resolve. As the disastrous meeting concluded, the board chairman took Thornton aside into a private virtual breakout room. The board has also voted to launch an immediate and thorough internal investigation into this matter, Richard, he said, his voice cold and devoid of any prior camaraderie. We need to understand precisely how these decisions were made, and whether proper corporate risk assessments were conducted. The implication was clear as glass. Thornton's position was no longer just precarious, it was finished. His high-stakes gamble had failed spectacularly. In Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré received confirmation that Sentinel operatives were hastily departing the country. The intelligence had come from multiple sources, including a final, crucial piece of information from Fatou in London, whose courage had proven invaluable. He had won. This round, at least. But he harbored no illusions that the war was over. Companies like Global X had deep resources and long memories. They would look for other ways to protect their interests, other weaknesses to exploit. 1 week later, as the new mining regulations officially came into effect, Traoré visited his mother again. They sat in the same garden, drinking tea as if nothing had happened. He had not told her the full story of the threats, the surveillance, or the high-stakes confrontation with one of the world's most powerful men. But somehow, as always, she seemed to know. "I heard," she said, a small, proud smile on her face, "that the foreign mining companies will now pay more for our gold. And that they must hire more of our people." Traoré nodded. "Yes. The new regulations are expected to increase government revenue by 34%. The funds will be used for what we need most. Infrastructure, education, healthcare." His mother smiled slightly. "Good. It is about time we stopped allowing others to become rich from what lies beneath our own feet." The darkness that had threatened her had been transformed into a promise of light for her nation's future.